Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the next panel, looking at abated energy production and the growth of carbon capture and storage. Perfect segue there. We had Ian Conn say that the only thing that money is going into is EVs, solar, and wind, because they're the things that are scalable. But we have people on the stage here, and we have broadly held sort of expert opinion on this, is that carbon capture and storage needs to be part of the energy transition too, if we're going to find a way to get to net zero. So, joined by a fantastic panel today, we have Jerry Farrell, Senior Vice President of Acre Solutions. We have Gustavo Baquero from Harbour Energy. We have Deepak Maheshwari from Essar Energy, Chief Executive Officer, and we have Alex Holden, Chief Operating Officer of Levidian. So, gentlemen, let's get straight into this. Carbon capture and storage. We've heard a lot about carbon capture and storage over the years. It's one of the great hopes for being able to decarbonise sectors, particularly those which are hard to abate, hard to switch over to renewable energy. I'm interested just to get your, first of all, a take of where you think the sector is at this time. And because Jerry has had the bad luck to sit next to me, I'm going to ask him first.
Oh, thank you. So where's the sector at the moment? I think it's at a crossroads. There's been a few false dawns in the UK on carbon capture projects, fairly recently really, with the White Rose project not too long ago. But I think there's a growing optimism now within... by the way, I work for Acre Solutions, so we're a tier 1 engineering company, so I'm coming at this from a contractor perspective, so supply chain basically. So I think there's a growing optimism now within the supply chain that it will happen this time. But maybe I'll come on to it later. I think there's still some scepticism and some caution about that as well.
Okay. Gustavo, I'm going to come down the line. We'll keep this nice and simple. Your company, Harbour Energy, not too long ago has received Track 2 status in the United Kingdom for the development of one of the carbon capture projects in an industrial cluster. Big moment for you as a company, but is this all happening fast enough? I mean, there was a fair bit of frustration that it took quite a long time between the initial push towards Track 1 clusters and Track 2. Is this all just going a little bit slowly for your tastes?
I would say yes. I would say, we could have had a year of delay so far, but once the decision of Track 2 was made, and by the way, we have 2 projects on Track 2. So for the audience, there's 4 projects that have been in the track process, and we have Viking now, which we operate together with BP as partners, and then we also have Acorn, which is the Scottish clusters, that was also Track 2. So we got 2 Track 2 projects now out of the 4 that exist in the UK. But I think that Track 2 was a significant milestone because it creates a momentum that is very important. Now we need to have the discussions with the emitters that are going to be part of that ecosystem. And that actually sets, it gives us clarity towards what we're going to have now, that it's the front-end engineering and getting closer, hopefully in a few years, to final investment decisions. So, yeah, it takes a little bit of time. There's a lot of bureaucracy around, but we shouldn't underestimate the importance of collaboration around these projects because they're massive and you need many stakeholders to make them happen.
Well, Deepak, you were one of the, I won't say lucky because, people make their own luck in this industry, but you got Track 1 status on project that Essar is involved in on this. So you've had a little bit longer to be involved, I guess, in the sector. What's your sense right now? Are you confident that this will follow through, we'll get FID, we will see a real carbon capture project take hold in the not too distant future in the UK?
Yep. So first of all, I just want to build in with the discussion that the previous panel was also having, where the decarbonization clearly means that not only do we have to decarbonize the electrons, but we also need to decarbonize the molecules. And the decarbonization of the molecules will clearly come through because of the carbon capture projects that Track 2 as well as Track 1 are currently undergoing. Our experience has been is that if there is that these are very complicated projects, They're complex and a significant amount of sequencing is required because you have to create the complete ecosystem around it. So not only are you doing as to what the company needs to be doing, but all your other users of hydrogen would also need to be integrated within that. So there's a lot of collaboration which is required. For a cluster to really succeed, there needs to be an alignment of objectives. There needs to be significant amount of investment which needs to be made, and people need to be ready to make that investment. And all of this is seen by the government when they are seeing as to how successful your project is going to be. How is the ecosystem going to develop is an important factor. We have the experience of having participated in this in the track 1, and we are actively engaged with the government at this point of time in order to see as to how we can get to FID. The target for FID for track 1 continues to be September 24, and we think that we are in a good position to do that. Very active engagement with the government at this point of time.
Okay. For Alex, you're coming at this from a slightly different angle from the sort of the traditional carbon capture, this idea of taking it out from rather than out into the North Sea or similar to be stored on the ground. What's your sense for people who are proposing alternative methods of carbon capture and storage? Is the support there from the government right now in the UK?
I think the UK landscape is challenging. So Levidian is a carbon capture and use business. So we have a point source pre-combustion carbon capture methodology which captures that carbon into graphene, which is a high performance additive which can go into a battery or a tire or a composite or a thermoplastic. So what we see is there is funding and support available for the large projects that these gentlemen have just mentioned, but actually for those more innovative technologies that are kind of coming through point of source disrupting, where you maybe don't need the large scale logistics to pipe something underground, the support is limited, whereas in other markets, the US through IRA and some of the Middle Eastern countries, there is a push to adopt these technologies before they hit that economic proof point and prove out that they can work, prove that they scale. The point for us about carbon capture is carbon is a valuable part of our life cycle. Therefore, let's use it. Let's put it to good use. Let's put it into an EV battery and make it perform better. Let's put it into a tire and reduce the particulates and reduce the rolling resistance. Let's use it. We've worked really hard on it.
For carbon capture to really sort of, what's your sense, I guess, from the general public right now? Do you feel that the general public understands what carbon capture is trying to achieve? That there is this sense of how it can work, how it's going to operate? Come to Jeremy.
That's a really good question. I think my barber was asking me about carbon capture recently when I was in my haircut. So I think that tells you something, that it is kind of in the general societal interest now. So I think there's a sort of a slight suspicion that all that CCS is going to do is be used for oil production, and that's that's a reasonable viewpoint given that so far most of it has been. So I think there's a bit of work to do to get the general public over, and I think the key to that really is the speed of implementation of projects that aren't necessarily EOR projects. If we can move a bit faster and get some good news stories out there, which is about Aker Solutions, for example, is working on the Brevik project, which will be the world's first CCS capture project from a cement factory, and that should go live next year. And projects like that, when they do go live, I think that'll have a big impact on the general public. They'll see, okay, this is real, capturing carbon and storing it. So, and back to the point that Gustavo made, I think in the UK, the progress has been okay, but not fast enough. And I think what we need really is to keep that momentum going, and then the general public, and get some of these good news stories, and I think the general public will come with us on that journey then.
Gustavo, how important do you think carbon capture is in that sense for keeping some traditional industries going in the UK? When we look at these industrial clusters, many of them are by their nature, are in heavily industrialised areas. is this the key for them being able to maintain?
It is. Let me just also back to, there's no scenario to get to net zero that does not include carbon capture in its equation. So we need to recognize there's no single silver bullet in this effort. So, and carbon capture will play a significant role there. I've been, in different places to try to see where are the best, you could say, ecosystems to have carbon capture. You need to have three things. You need to have the geology, you need to have reservoirs, you need to have industry already so you can repurpose the infrastructure, and you also need to have the skills and the labor around it. So this normally happens around industrialized hubs, better if you have reservoirs offshore. That's why the UK is so well positioned to be one of the first countries that actually achieves carbon capture at a very large scale. So that is important. When it comes to, I'll give you just very specific figures. Viking, the project that we operate in the Humber. People sometimes is afraid with the energy transition. If you go to certain areas, they will say the energy transition will make my job disappear. Because these are traditional coal. If you go to, for example, in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, or Ohio, you cannot even mention the word energy transition because that means I'm out of a job. But that's not the case because actually you can repurpose those jobs. Viking, the calculations we have made that will create additional, will preserve 20,000 jobs, and will create, on top of those 20,000, will create 10,000 jobs more. And we're talking of investments just for these projects around £7 billion, just for Viking. So the virtuous cycle that comes with these projects is very important. We have not done a good enough job to explain that to the public. So, and we're trying to do so, because this is actually a virtuous cycle that we can create around this. And by the way, and we're tackling the climate change issue.
Just coming back to your original question, David, I think there are two problems for the public. One is that carbon capture in most senses is invisible, so it's very hard for them to go and see it, touch it, feel it, see it in action. One of the nice things about our technology is you can genuinely see black dust coming out of the back of the box, so you know that you're capturing that carbon. I think also the other problem is scale. The numbers we talk about are monstrous, and I don't think people on the street or even people in this room or people within big energy companies have a grapple on some of those numbers. You're talking about 30 billion tons per annum being added to the CO2 problem, 2 trillion tons of emissions overall. I mean, these are mind-boggling numbers that are so hard for someone to get their head around. So I think it's really hard for the public to get a grapple on it, and I think our politicians don't help that either.
To come to Deepak, okay, so as politicians, they have some grasp of this. I mean, they're helping with taxpayers' funding to seed what is a nascent industry. I think there's broad-based party support for that because this is new. They're trying to make these industrial hubs with CCUS happen. What do you think the longer-term projection is, though? Is this an industry that one day will be able to stand on its own 2 feet, albeit with a carbon price to make that feasible, or is it one that likely will require some form of long-term public government support?
I think the challenge for most governments is that they should ensure that decarbonization does not lead to deindustrialization, because that's a very easy solution, that you reduce the industry footprint and you can then obviously decarbonize. So the right framework and the right incentives needs to be provided to the industry. At this point of time, the way the industry and the framework is that there is a disincentive for us in the sense that we need to buy the carbon credits and the ETS framework which exists. But when you look at it from a refinery perspective, we compete with products which can be imported from countries where there is no carbon tax to be paid. So it is very important for the government to come up with the right framework which not only motivates the investment which needs to be made for carbon capture, because as we all agree, and especially within the industry, that carbon capture is absolutely essential in order to achieve the decarbonization goals, because just green electron is not the solution. How do you make the molecule more blue or green really makes a big difference. And so the right incentive, the right motivation needs to be created, the right framework needs to be created, which takes into consideration the overall risk and the return, and a reasonable time frame needs to be provided for all the investors. Along with that, the government needs to make adjustments and make modifications to any cross-border adjustments which need to be made on import of certain products. So these are some of the factors which the government needs to consider in order to be able to ensure that there is a right framework and motivation for the for private sector investors to make the investments in this particular sector, because without these investments, the decarbonization goals which exist for the country are not going to be possible.
If you wanted to come in there, Gustavo.
Just building on that, I think there's a very interesting capital raise happening at the moment. One, it's in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, and the other one is in the UK. These are massive capital-intensive projects with, the returns yet to be seen. But what we see in our economics is they're very thin. The margins are very thin compared to kind of the capital-intensive traditional projects. The US has taken an approach which is more market-driven, typical of the US. I don't see any carbon tax happening anytime soon in the US, but they have decided to go through what they call the 45Q, which is this line in the tax bill where they get the credit depending on how much CO2 you inject. So let's see if the market forces drive this happening first in the US. In the UK, it's much more government-driven with the track process. So I'm really curious to see, which is going to be more effective. I do think that the carbon capture and scale will happen in very few geographies in the next 5 years. That it's in the US, I would bet for the Gulf of Mexico, coast, US, in the UK, perhaps Australia, and Norway. But that, the regimes around those 4 countries, because they're going to be, of course, dependent on the fiscal regimes that they establish, is going to be interesting. So I think we're in not a crossroad, but a very interesting moment in time where we'll see which of these regimes will attract most capital to execute on these major projects.
Different models.
Yeah, I think just in terms of the government involvement, I think it's going to be some time before that can drop, but ultimately I think it probably will. These projects, these are large, first-of-a-kind projects, they're expensive, and the nature of carbon capture and storage is complex in the chain. You have the emitters, then you have the transportation and storage companies. They have to have contracts with each other, and some of those contracts rely on the emitters having government funding, and the storage companies as well. So it's a very complex chain here. I was at the Copenhagen CCS conference earlier this year, and what comes across at that conference is it's not really a technological problem here. It's much more about the commercial agreements between the companies and the complexity of it. So I think government does need to be involved with that to kind of drive that process, to give investors confidence. But also, as I said earlier, supply chain, where we are, supply chain needs confidence as well that these projects are going to happen. We're involved in the Net Zero Teesside project. We've done the front-end engineering with BP. So I've actually attended a few sessions in the Northeast talking to the supply chain, trying to build up that interest. And there is a lot of interest there. But there's also, as I said earlier, quite a lot of scepticism about these projects going ahead because of the previous history. So it's not only is it needed for investors and the people developing the projects, but for the supply chain as well.
When we talk about the models, can I make an observation myself, please? I'm keen to get the panel's view on this. Is much of this not ultimately driven by a market, though, in the UK and Europe in the form of the carbon price? I mean, if the carbon price is very high, then storing carbon and capturing carbon and storing it makes a lot more sense. And you can start to build a merchant model which is perhaps less reliant on government subsidy. Is that a fair comment? And is that a stable basis on which to build the future of the carbon capture and storage industry?
So if I may. I think the carbon costs, if you would see over the last 2 or 3 years, have been extremely volatile. And there are a number of factors which influence it, including international factors, such as we have seen that the carbon costs went up significantly higher after the episodes in Ukraine. And following that in this particular year, because the QE of carbon credits that the government has done, the pricing has come significantly lower than what it is in the European market. So to just use that as a benchmark to make an investment decision can be quite erroneous, because it is extremely volatile. So hence the framework which the government really provides in order to incentivize private sector has to be devoid of or not linked to the market volatility of carbon. But it has to be based on a reference price, which I think what the government is trying to do. And on that basis, different models can be evolved. But it cannot be specifically linked to the market price of carbon because of its volatility.
I would agree. If you see where the carbon price now in the UK is, it's much lower than it was before. So if you, and that volatility will remain. I think what we're trying to solve here is to capture as much CO2 as possible and to leave it there and stored for decades, forever. So it's about the incentives, and that's why I think the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is creating an incentive. The more you capture, the more you win. So, I mean, again, yet to be seen, because the question is for how long those incentives will be in place, the 45Q incentives that were increased, and depending who is in government in the UK, in the US, can revert or not that. So I think that's why I'm saying at the moment that we are, it's fundamental, and companies like ours that are ready to deploy billions of dollars into this, that is the main point. It's kind of the commercial framework and the fiscal framework that will guarantee our investment with a decent return to make those investments happen.
Alex.
I give a counterpoint to that, because our model is not so reliant on those carbon prices, because we've got monetization through the graphene. We can give a successful and economic commercial model to our customers that kind of de-risks them away from that. So it's something that potentially lends some support to a pre-combustion capture technology and a usage rather than a straight storage.
In terms of the pre-combustion approach, how scalable do you think that is? I mean, obviously the larger projects we're seeing are going, I hesitate to use the word traditional, because traditional in carbon capture and storage doesn't make a great deal of sense. But how scalable do you think sort of the pre-combustion approach you're pursuing could be?
It's certainly difficult, and scale, as I mentioned earlier, in this whole problem is monstrous. But coming back to one of the other points is, there's no one technology or one solution that's going to win out in a huge way. And any government or business that's looking for a silver bullet that's suddenly going to deliver 50% of our journey to net zero, that's simply not going to happen. So we have a unit at the moment which will capture 1,000 tons of carbon per year. We are well on our way to a 10x unit and a 100x unit. So the contribution can be pretty significant. If you look at the amount of graphene usage you may need per annum in 3 verticals, you're talking something like 20 million tons over the next 5 years. So it is a small contributor, but not insignificant, and probably runs faster than some of these giga projects that are very, very complex to deliver.
Just I mean, on pre-combustion, different technology to yours, Alex, but in Norway, the Sleipner project is a pre-combustion project where the CO2 is captured from the gas stream and then re-injected into the subsurface. That's been storing 1 million tons of CO2 since the mid-90s, so 30 years. So, this can be done. Pre-combustion technology at scale can be done.
So, I mean, the broad view is the technology is there. We just need to find out how to make it happen, how to fund it, how to go.
Yeah, I think from our point of view, you need to give innovative technologies a time to succeed. So a lot of the government funding you look at is aimed at very, very large projects and very well-developed technologies. What we'd maybe like to see from both private markets and government markets is some targeting at those more innovative, disruptive technologies.
Okay. And I think that's the IRA. I mean, everybody talks about the amount of money that's been put into the IRA, but one of the interesting things for me is that the threshold of projects that can qualify now for funding from IRA has been massively reduced. So for projects, down from 100,000 tonnes down to 12.5 for industrial projects, and for direct air capture from 100,000 down to 1,000. So 1,000 tonnes, that's a small emitter.
Yeah.
So that's going to really kick off that market in the small emitters, which we don't have in the UK at the moment.
Yeah, and we can already see that happening. So we've got conversations with a number of US customers at small scale.
That feeds in very nicely to a question I've had come in from one of our viewers online, and then I will open it up to the floor for questions here in the room. This is to the broad panel. How much do you think COP28 is going to unlock capital for carbon capture and put CCUS on the map?
You go ahead. I can answer it.
Yep. Please do.
I don't think not much. It's the short answer because, I mean, the unlock the capital. This is private capital, huh?
Yeah.
And the private capital is, in the COP28, they're not going to get and talk about, the specific fiscal and commercial regimes. Discussions like investment allowances in the carbon capture. That's a decision by a specific government or entity that will take that decision. So I think that it's going to be very little, if you ask me. That's my short answer.
Any disagreements?
No, I don't disagree at all. I think it's all a function of what the regulatory framework is provided by the governments to incentivize private sector participation in decarbonization. And most private sector organizations will align themselves to whatever the country's plans are. So as our business, we are aligned to what the UK 10-point program is. And we know that our production processes have 2 million tons of carbon in our production processes, and we need to get it down to 0.5 as per our plan. But it's completely aligned to what the government in the UK wishes to do. And so individuals and companies will be more driven by the regulatory framework and the incentive mechanisms set up by the governments rather than bodies which are outside it.
I'll give an alternative view to that. I think actually COP28 have been very progressive and encouraging of smaller businesses to give them a platform to get them in front of some of those bigger funders, some of those venture funders. So I think it moves the needle a small amount, and any opportunity to get that platform and that face-to-face time is always going to be valuable.
Let me throw it open to the floor. Yes, we have a question. He already has the microphone.
Thanks very much for an interesting panel and discussion. I'm Richard Pugh from SAFER. Question really in terms of, from a target cost of abatement point of view, what do you need? What is the sort of, notwithstanding the fact that you've got volatility in the carbon offset price, which is fully understood, but if you were to have an IRA-esque target to aim for, what sort of cost of abatement is realistic?
I think a generally accepted figure is about $100 per tonne. Aker Solutions has a sister company called Aker Carbon Capture. They own the capture technology, and they're quoting for their full service, if you like, a CO2 removal service, between 75 and 150, I think, is their quotation at the moment.
The IRA established $85 per ton, for example. So that gives you an idea, and there's line of sight of economics depending on the development concepts that you have. So I would tend to agree it's more or less on that level, but that's for technology-based solutions. I'm not talking nature-based solutions, which it's much lower than that. That's technology-based solutions around that range.
I have another question from the audience towards the back there, please.
Hi, I'm Stelios from Malmi Tankers. A quick one for Gustavo. Do you foresee any significant potential for carbon capture carriage by vessels in shipping?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part of the question? Significant carbon capture on?
Potential for carriage in shipping.
So like shipping in
Yeah. Oh, yes. I think, you see there's one major project happening at the moment, Northern Lights in Norway, which is, that's the concept. I mean, it's transporting CO2 and injecting it in the Norwegian continental shelf, and that's operated by Equinor with Shell and Total as partners as well. Significant initial funding from the Norwegian state. So yes, it will. I mean, but it would play a role regionally. I would say the North Sea, for example, you have the larger kind of European emitter, it's Germany, and they don't have this solution because they don't have kind of the reservoirs to do this. So they have to ship it or pipe it. So I do think there's going to be economies around the North Sea. I do think in Southeast Asia there will be economies around, Japan, Singapore, South Korea. We'll need to find places, be it Australia or Indonesia, that have the capacity to store the CO2. And I would say also in the Gulf of Mexico area, that would be perhaps but later. But I would say mainly the North Sea and Southeast Asia areas where CO2 shipping will play a role in hopefully in the midterm.
I would just add Liverpool Bay to it as well. Because in Liverpool Bay, where ENI is, we have the ability to store in Liverpool Bay also the CO2 which is from the sequestration process. So that's another opportunity or an option for a number of UK businesses which are, say, based out of the southeast and in Wales. If they can capture the carbon, then they can always bring it to the standalone manufacturing complex, where we are going to develop tanks which can store, and we can then also put it into the same pipes, which is going to capture the CO2 from our industrial carbon capture project as well as from HyNet.
Yeah, are we really talking about a regional or potentially even global market, whereby those that have the ability to sequester large amounts of CO2 will be making money from areas which do not, but who wish to meet their own climate targets? I mean, this is the merchant model.
I don't think long distance shipping for CO2 will happen. That's my personal view, by the way. And it's going to be too costly to move this. And remember, this is about waste management as well. So I don't think the margins are going to be massive either. So no, I think it would stay regionally, either piped or regionally shipped around collaboration of countries that need the service and countries that can provide that service. And I mean, I see the UK as a service provider because of the reasons that I said before. I see Norway, and perhaps there are others that are trying to get there, like Denmark and the Netherlands, but I think they're a bit, scale-wise, not as the same level as Norway and the UK for the North Sea at least.
Okay, we've got time for one last question, or we don't have time, but let's do it anyway. We have a question from the floor, please.
Appreciate that, thank you. Answer Shul from General Electric, very quickly. So my question to panelists is, in your view, what is the single biggest blocker for this technology to be adopted at mass scale? Thank you.
Any volunteers? I will pick someone.
Yes. I think the biggest challenge in the utilization is how do you sequester the CO2? Because the technology which is required to capture CO2 is well developed, and it's available on large scale as well. Of course, the regulatory framework ensures that it has to be well developed and it has to be mature, and it's a cost and OPEX and all of that on the life cycle needs to be established. But unless you have a place to sequester the CO2, what are you going to do with capturing the CO2? So if you want to do it on the large scale, you need to be close to either a Liverpool Bay or North Sea in the UK. That's the only way that you will be successful in capturing large amounts of CO2.
Fantastic. I'm sorry to say that we've run out of time, but I'd like to first of all thank all our panelists for a fantastic discussion and great insights, and also to the audience for some brilliant questions. So thank you very much to everyone. Hope to see you back here soon. Thank you.